Hello. My subject in this talk is autism and families, and I'm hoping that my unusual perspective on this as a family counsellor will give you some new understanding and a new and perhaps more optimistic view of autism. Because a family counsellor is trained to think about families as systems. That is to say, we take the impact of people on people as a huge part of the explanation for their behaviour. And just as a heating engineer sets up a system with a boiler and radiators, and we call it central heating, in families we see the same basic idea, especially in autistic families, that the person on the spectrum is a kind of boiler and everybody else in the family is a radiator, strongly affected by the behaviour of the boiler. But each of them expressing that in a different way. Each of them has their own thermostat. Each of them relates to their own space. So when one thinks systemically about a family with an autistic member, one sees actually that the force of the autism in the family member impacts on everybody in different ways, and we see patterns which amount to a series of roles that the other members of the family fall into. And my first offering to you in this talk is a description of those roles, emphasising that they are only roles. They can be changed, they can be swapped. It's not fate, it's a role we play under the pressure of relating to the boiler. So the most obvious role in all families where there's autism, the one role that must be played by some family member, is what we call the life support system for the person on the spectrum. This is usually mum, but it can be dad, it could be a grandparent, it could be a sibling. And I've worked in families where it was a twin. But whoever it is, they're supplying the missing functioning for the person on the spectrum, and in that sense they're their life support. They're the one who keeps the person safe and functioning. There's very often the opposite to the life supports. There's an antagonist, somebody whose jaw is set in contradiction to the person on the spectrum. Somebody who keeps insisting there are rules that mustn't be broken. Somebody who takes great offence at the spectrum behaviour. So an antagonist could be very often the dad, especially if the person on the spectrum is a boy. Or it could be a grandparent whose old-fashioned sense of things is deeply offended by autistic behaviour. It could be a sibling, it could be anyone. But the chances are, if this antagonism is profound and very difficult to shift, the chances are that this person is also on the spectrum. And they're protecting their autistic sense of proper behaviour against the inexperienced, erratic behaviour of a young person with on the spectrum. There could be a diplomat in the family, somebody who's endlessly smoothing things over, finding ways of changing the atmosphere, looking for the best in in all sides of the family. And that could well be a younger sibling or an older sibling who understands the internal problem of the child on the spectrum and understands as well where his parents are coming from. There could be somebody in the family who's completely detached doesn't get involved in the arguments, doesn't want to hear about them. That could be, again, a younger sibling who sees all the fuss around his brother or sister and can't be doing with it. So he increasingly goes next door, where the family emotions are nothing to do with him, and they have a good, a good Wi-Fi, and he disappears out of the picture. And there may also be a kind of a shining contrast to the person on the spectrum, somebody who's held up by the family as a golden child. And of course, by implication, the kid on the spectrum is being scapegoated and blamed. So the family get their self-respect, so to speak, and maybe their public profile from another child. Let's say the kid who plays the piano to a very high standard, or is a wizard at tennis. And life in that family consists in endlessly contrasting the behaviour of the good child with the bad child. And nobody in that family would suspect what a family counsellor like me suspects, which is that that shining child is also on the spectrum. But they've found a socially acceptable way of expressing their need to be occupied, all those hours of piano practice, or all that hyperactivity that goes into being a tennis star. That's their solution, and because they're meeting a kind of public expectation about what a good child is like, they escape the introspection and fearfulness which dogs the child who's on the spectrum and has already been diagnosed. So the golden child has a very different experience of their childhood, and would be astonished and maybe horrified to hear that he has so much in common with his brother, because his life is founded on the opposite assumption. So these roles are very frequently found in interviewing families with a member on the spectrum. And for a family counsellor, it's very important to be clear that each role comes with its own problems. Even that golden child could slip up one day and need help from the mental health services. All of those roles come with their own problems, and all of them deserve consideration and support. The family life supporter deserves some time to themselves. If this is mum, she needs some friends of her own and maybe a hobby that gets her out of the house. If the antagonist is driving himself into a rage in his relationship with his child, he deserves to understand what autism really is and recognise that some of the behaviour he hates in his child is exactly what he was doing at the same age. The chips off the same block, so to speak. And the detached child needs help to understand why his family is so different, and a chance to become more psychologically aware, not just by cutting out, but by realising that the family has a real challenge, and he could be a constructive part of it, including by helping his mum, so to speak. So, what a family counsellor with a systemic training sees when they look at a family with autism is, in a sense, a flourishing culture around a challenge, and one in which, as you've heard me say, many other people in the family could actually be part of the same genetic material as the diagnosed child on the spectrum. Except for the diplomat in that family, every one of those roles could be filled by somebody else on the spectrum. And it's a quite common experience when we organise groups under the funding for Living Well With Autism. It's a common experience that some of the people who come in thinking that they're only there to support their child on the spectrum, many of those people go away thinking, gosh, so it was me too. You might think a mother who's a life support system for a child on the spectrum will be neurotypical, but she may actually be on the spectrum, and the child may be her passion and special interest. She may have devoted her life to making the world more tolerable to him in a way which is beyond the neurotypical devotion. She may actually be herself quite obsessional and quite disinclined to confront the world, except on behalf of her child. And as I've already said, the antagonistic dad is almost certainly on the spectrum because of the height of his antagonism and his inflexibility. The shining sibling, as I say, also could be on the spectrum, just making it work better for him. So what we're uncovering when we look at families with autism is that the genetic connection and the probability of autism in other members of the family is very high, much higher than the current scientific figures propose. The science doesn't seem to be adequate to describing the autistic family because the science doesn't really allow for the impact of time and maturity on the symptoms of autism. Because the very best thing that can happen to somebody on the spectrum is that they live a long time and get better at being on the spectrum. So a child aged 7 very commonly will be diagnosed because at school they're acting up. They don't seem to get social regulations. They don't. They seem to be out of it. They don't even get the point of schools. Often they think it's a kind of prison. And they may have some very distressing habits like headbanging, which nobody can ignore. So that child gets diagnosed quite quickly. But the child who is deeply questioning their place in the world and very unsure about social behaviour could equally be very, very quiet, not noisy at all. Often that's the presentation of girls who don't get diagnosed characteristically at 7, but maybe at 12. So if they take the quiet route, they slip under the radar. And if they get beyond school and begin to create a life that makes sense to them, they won't be called autistic or come up for a diagnosis because their way of life is the solution to their problem. And we think many people who hated school but fall into a role, let's say, as a craftsperson or in catering, behind the scenes, doing repetitive but fine tasks, those people will probably be on the spectrum. I've worked with a number of chefs, a number of bakers, and I've worked with a woodworker. A classic solution for a young man who needs to be occupied would be to be a mechanic. Maybe he's a biker. but he knows a huge amount about engines, so he gets to work in a garage, or he becomes a self-employed plumber because he gets systems. Plumbers, electricians, they have the autistic ability to link things together and to solve problems. And if they're self-employed, they can avoid problems with authority and run their lives the way they want to. And once a life is being lived like this, nobody will call it autistic. They'll say the guy is the strong silent type or introverted, but they won't use the term autistic. But the truth is, especially if this guy marries and has children, the truth is he's made of the same genetic material as his son, who, as I say, at age 7, may easily be diagnosed at school. And the clinical psychologist or the education psychologist at that point finds it easy to create a statistic out of the child. But they have no motive to question the father about why he's a plumber. So the statistics don't take in the real prevalence of autism in that family, let alone the father of the father, who, let's say, was well known for his bad temper and was called a great character, and was prone to do amazing things in his rages, like throw his Christmas dinner out of the window, as I heard a story from one family. Grandpa threw his Christmas dinner out of the window because the gravy touched the meat, and he already told everybody that must never happen. He had the same phobia about the arrangement on his plate that we now hear so frequently from small children, that they can't bear the gravy to touch the potatoes or the meat or whatever, and they won't eat it if it does. So we think that the real prevalence of autism is hugely greater than the statistics have begun to suggest. But we're not making this point to intimidate or know better than others. The value of saying this very clearly is that it really means every family of this kind is already expert in managing autism, and the apparent drama around a diagnosis is really misplaced. What we're talking about is a developmental delay, which is very noticeable in primary school children, and something of a hazard during the teenage years, but which becomes infinitely less significant as the person gets older and learns to manage their intense feelings and to behave more socially, until they disappear, so to speak, into the social fabric, just as in the very many previous generations has always happened when we didn't use the term autism, but we talked about just introversion or geekiness or solitariness or maybe depression and Jekyll and Hyde personalities or whatever. It may be now that we were touching on the autism diagnosis with all those words, and now we have the proper description, which enables us to think more clearly about what the internal experience of people on the spectrum and its real biological causes in brain wiring, which I've described before in a previous talk. So the thought I'm leaving you with is that in families with autism, there's already a huge amount of expertise and understanding, because the 7-year-old is really only a version of dad. the girl who's tearful and stressed and self-harming at 10, 12, 14 is only a version of her shy mum. And just as previous generations, the grandparents survived and flourished, and mum and dad have created their families in their turn, these children will come through as well.